Porokāte is a podcast by the Hori and Te Kuru. Toitu te porokāte, toitu te reo Māori.
Kia ora te whānau, welcome back to Te Porokāte, to Te Porokāte. My name is Hori.
Tēnā koutou, ko tō tātou manuhiri te rānei, ko tākuta Carwyn Jones, he mātanga ture mō ngā kaupapa iwi taketake, he kaituhi, he kai kōrero, mō ngā take e pāna ki Te Tiriti o Waitangi me te pūnaha tō rangapū i Aotearoa nei, waihoki he pūkenga i te whare wānanga o Raukawa. Tākuta Carwyn, tēnā koe.
Tēnā koe, tēnā kōrua.
And we were just having a little bit of a kōrero before we came on. Obviously a very toe dude here, which may be a bit of a contrast to old mate over here. And I was telling you about, being over with some old mates of mine over the coast, and they were talking about, what have you been up to? Seeing there's a lot of political stuff happening. Like, what's the problem here? I thought we were all one people. Waitangi was years ago. Why are we even worrying about it? And all of a sudden, I get quite abrupt, and I'm like, well, here we go. And it's real reaction, like on that. And I was talking about maybe you potentially could have some pointers for when people get asked questions like, what's the problem with Waitangi? That stuff's so long ago. Why do we need to worry about this now? What would you say to some Christians that might, in your cool, calm and collective way, not in my way, obviously?
Yeah, well, so, one of the things that I find when I'm talking to people, who come with those kinds of questions, and sometimes I get them like after I've written something that's, been on in an op-ed piece or whatever, I'll get some emails, responding to it. And one of the things I find, I first of all, try and deal with them initially at least as though these are good faith questions. And lots of people are asking them in good faith. Lots of people don't have the information. They don't understand the kind of impact of the kind of the disregard of Te Tiriti and of tino rangatiratanga, the impact that has had on our communities. And so sometimes it's just a matter of talking through some of those things, and people will have their own kōrero, maybe even within their own whānau. But certainly one of the things I've found that it's helpful, can be helpful to point people towards, say, like Waitangi Tribunal reports, because there are Waitangi Tribunal reports about the different rohe around the motu, and people are often really interested in hearing about their own rohe, Pākehā, Māori, whatever. And so those can often be good ways of talking to people about actually what happened. And when people understand the impact of that, often that is a way of you get the response of, gee, I didn't know that. Now I kind of understand a little bit more about what you're getting at there. But I also am always reminded of Moana Jackson in these spaces, and the way that he always remained calm no matter what he was dealing with. And one of the things I always really looked to him to do, or saw him doing, was he made it really clear that you didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room to persuade people or to talk to people and engage with people and to bring them along with your thinking or share your thinking with them. And he was a fantastic speaker and really persuasive and funny and all those kinds of things. But I think most of all that the way that he ensured that he understood the issues, he had good information, and he also was always really principled in the way that he talked with people. So he never made it about individuals, people. He always went back to thinking about what are these principles, and in fact, how do I want to behave with integrity in this context?
Yeah.
Is that what you tell yourself if you ever like if someone's challenging you out the blue? What are the tools to keep yourself cool, calm, and collected?
Because for me, it would be a tactic. I would need to like take that tactic.
You need a
would be
slogan
like,
or something.
or something that would be like
A
okay,
woolsa.
Yeah, like calm yourself down because, all right, let's
Be like
talk about
channel Moana J. What would Moana J do?
Channel Carwyn right here.
Yeah.
What would he do? Yeah, because it gets hard sometimes when you're constantly challenged, and you must get challenged all the time.
Yeah,
bro.
no. And I think the kind of idea of thinking about trying to channel Moana is always a good thing to try and do. But you're right that it is hard when you're getting these kinds of challenges constantly and feeling the need to defend stuff. And so I guess the other thing is to remember is that actually, none of us need to have all the answers to all of this stuff. And sometimes the response might be to the person, well, actually, you need to go away and get some more information, do your reading or whatever, point them to whether it's stuff on things like E Tangata or those kinds of places that have really good kōrero that's accessible, those kinds of things. And so, yes, sometimes it is, you don't need to always be in that fight. Like I think it's important to state your position, be clear about where you stand and how you feel on these issues, and as much as possible to have had some kōrero yourself, and to make sure you're prepared for these discussions. But actually, so long as you've put up your position, then you don't necessarily need to have to convince other people. They can do work themselves. There are others of us who are also going to be engaging in that space, and we can do it better probably collectively, rather than one by one of us trying to engage.
Yeah, and I mean, this individual, like, easily, you will not persuade this person any other way. So it was like, trying to go, look, here's the history. Here's where we are. We were actually in a really privileged situation. We were able to go away, do something for our mate. We were able to afford to go do this. And, we didn't even blink an eye at the cost of what that was. And I said that to him, and I was just like, but there are some people that would never even be able to dream of even being able to do what we can do without even thinking about it. And trying to acknowledge those people, like that's what I was trying to give a comparison to for him. And the other one was the one when he was like, well, Waitangi happened so long ago. Like, why do we even keep going on about this? And I said, well, actually, it's not that long ago. Our other mate's dad's 80 years old. It was 185 years ago. So if you take it back, it's great-great-great-grandfathers. It's not that long ago. So, yeah, that was the kōrero I ended up having them. But it got quite heated.
Yeah, that's right. And I think too, like you're saying there, or in that kōrero, it sounds as though there's, also some work to kind of recognise his own privilege. And often that's the case too, right? There's some work. It's not just about information about Te Tiriti and Te Ao Māori. It's actually for people to understand their own privilege and in fact ways in which they can help to they can sometimes use their privilege to help lift other people up and support others as well. Right. So that's part of it. I was just also reminded of one other aspect of Moana's approach, which I think is really important, and is that he was always really staunch. Like he knew his position and he knew his argument and analysis, and was really clear about what tino rangatiratanga meant, really clear about what Te Tiriti meant, and so didn't resile from any of those things. Right. But he never banged the table and shouted about it, and he didn't need to, because he was able to, draw on all the skills that he had. We're not all one, I know that, but able to think about, well, what's the information that I've got that I can lay out that supports my position, and ultimately it's not my responsibility to convince others. You know, they need to sometimes do their own work before they're ready to hear what I'm saying.
Kia ora, Kaz.
So we're talking about attitudes towards everything that's been happening in the last 200 years, really. But more so recently, I guess what Hori's talking about, people starting to, non-Māori and many Māori as well, starting to sort of become more aware of the movement, the most recent iteration of the Mai Revolution. That's been happening since the 60s and 70s. When we go to constitutional kōrero, because all of this treaty stuff, I've been privy to a couple of hui where there's been talk about, with people like Takuta, Mākere Mutu and that, about constitutional reform. And my pātai for you today is, can we have a constitution, and will that enshrine Te Tiriti o Waitangi so that it can't be manipulated or removed from legislation like the current coalition government is doing?
Yeah. So those are good questions, and certainly one of the things that Mākere and Moana were led in that work around Mātake Mai, which was the Mātake Mai Aotearoa was the independent working group on constitutional transformation, and produced a report. And one of the things that was really one of the foundations of that process was thinking about what a constitution would look like that was based on, in part, Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So the terms of reference that the iwi chairs gave that group, and I had a small part in that group, the terms of reference they gave us was to develop models for a constitution that were based on, first of all, our kawa and tikanga, secondly, he whakaputanga, thirdly, Te Tiriti, and then fourthly, on international Indigenous Rights instruments. And this would include things like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so when we're talking about constitutions, and constitutional transformation, really what we're talking about is the kind of framework or the rules that society sets up for how they make laws and rules. And so that's really all a constitution is. And what they do, of course, is they determine, who gets to make particular decisions, what's the process for making those kinds of decisions. And in the Mātake Mai report, they kind of talk about thinking about the kind of concept and site of power in Te Ao Māori as being a way of thinking through some of these questions. And so you talk about the kind of concept of power in Te Ao Māori being encapsulated in mana, and the site of the, who gets to exercise that would be rangatira, but on behalf of a collective, usually hapu. And that was one of the things that came through really strongly in the kōrero that we had in hui around the Mātake Mai work, was a real strong sense that wherever we went, people wanted to find ways of recognising the autonomy of hapu and their mana. And that didn't want to operate in a collective way or at a national scale, but it was really important that autonomy of the hapu didn't get lost in those conversations or in those models.
So you talk about, it's got so many pātai that come up from that. Yeah. And I know it's a huge topic, and what you've just said is a really good way of condensing it for the layman like myself, everyday fella who I've never studied law or anything like that. And so, all of this kōrero, I always think about all our whānau who haven't been exposed to all this dialogue, and how do we communicate it to them so that we all feel like we're going on the waka together to this Hawaii hau, and whether or not where we're going to a constitutional place or not. So is it achievable? Can we do it in our lifetime or the next 3 generations? And the other pātai was, how do we move that conversation forward with this current coalition, or do we have to wait for the next one? Because we've got particular people in here who are even who are reacting to things that like King's Council decisions or statements, and they're pitting themselves against these groups. They're almost pitting the kāwanatanga against the law faculty, if you like, the law society, these different groups, and statements that they've put out. And to me, I haven't really seen that in previous governments or coalitions, that kind of bold sort of statement of, they make the laws, but we write the laws, you know. So do you think there's where are we at with this kōrero? It seems it's falling on deaf ears, certainly at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. So certainly in terms of, first of all, is this achievable? I think it's absolutely achievable. And part of what makes me think that is because we know before 1840, Māori were operating according to our own constitutional traditions and ways of organising ourselves and determining who has authority and what the limits of that authority are, how to hold our leaders accountable for decisions. All of those are encapsulated in our tikanga, so we know there's that possibility. But we also have Te Tiriti as a foundation for thinking about what that might look like in relation to the authority of kāwanatanga. So we know there's a kind of blueprint there already in Te Tiriti for understanding that these two spheres of authority, which is the language that the Waitangi Tribunal has used and Mātaki Mai uses, spheres of authority or spheres of influence, can operate alongside each other. And we can find mechanisms for how you determine who gets to say what, or, you know, what the boundaries of...
Who meets and where and
how. What the relation, you know, so in Mātaki Mai, there's the model is often thinking about a tino rangatiratanga sphere, a kāwanatanga sphere, but also thinking about that relational space in between and, you know, what those relationships are like. And you need to find mechanisms for doing that.
And would the Constitution hold that other side accountable is kind of what I'm saying. Is that the vision?
Or is it two different constitutions? Like,
importantly, like kāwanatanga and tino rangatiratanga, they each have their own kind of whakapapa as how they understand authority and how that should operate and what the mechanisms for accountability and transparency and all those kinds of things that we need in organising our leadership. No matter what society you're from, you need some kind of mechanisms to do that. And so kāwanatanga and tino rangatiratanga, they each kind of have different ways of managing that based on their different whakapapa, really. So within those spheres, you might think about, you know, the tino rangatiratanga sphere would organise how we want to organise our leadership and the rules around how we make law and all that kind of stuff, and kāwanatanga might want to do the same. But what a constitution might do might be to provide a framework for how those two sets of authority operate together in relationship to one another. And so you would set up, you know, often what a constitution does is determine, like, you know, in the kind of Western constitutions that we know, they often set out, well, okay, here's a parliament, and the parliament's job is making laws following this process. Then you have another role is for the courts, and their role is to determine, you know, make decisions about disputes, and they do that independently. And so a constitution sets out that kind of framework. And you can imagine the same kind of thing happening in terms of thinking about the relationship between the authority of tino rangatiratanga and the authority of kāwanatanga, that you could have mechanisms that define what the boundaries are between them, define how they're going to work together, and a constitution is just like the kind of framework for doing that.
So when they say constitutional change, like my immediate thing in my head is that are we talking about building on something that we've already got, or are we talking about pulling that down and like you said, reconstruction and the framework of what that looks like? Like, or are we building on something that is already there? Like, is that where your mind's going, or is it more around tearing something down and rebuilding it?
So one of the things, a couple of things. One there's a Indigenous academic from what's now the United States that I really like, and she was Aotearoa is her name. She talks about as kind of she's talking about a process of reconciliation, but one of the things she says, and she's kind of particularly thinking about the Native American context as a kind of metaphor, she says one of the first things you need to do is you need to take down the fort. So you need to dismantle those things which are still, still implementing colonialism and still having that impact on our whānau. So you need to stop the harm, first of all.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on this current sort of coalition and their attitudes towards it in terms of how it stirs up that kind of racist attitude and rhetoric? Because we've seen what happens around the world when you ignore what the UN's suggesting. We've seen the sort of disastrous devastation impact that can have, and here we've got this little old New Zealand government, kind of trying to parrot that same narrative.
Yeah, and I think it is really concerning the way in which there's been this deliberate rejection by the current government of this statement on Indigenous rights, which is, this is what the international community have said are the rights that Indigenous people have. So it's not just a small group of nations. In fact, when the declaration was being voted on at the General Assembly, there were only 4 countries that voted against the adoption of the declaration. That was Australia, the United States, Canada, and New Zealand.
Us.
Yeah, and actually all of them have since changed their position a little bit to have a kind of qualified acceptance of the declaration. Now, the declaration, it's not a treaty, it's not a convention. It's the other kind of language that the UN uses. So it's not something that has parties that you sign up to. So New Zealand's change in position didn't mean they suddenly signed up to something, because actually it's a statement that says Indigenous peoples have these rights. And what's more, that these are, while they are how the international community says we ought to particularly recognise the rights of Indigenous people, they are all grounded in well-established rights that all people have. So they are all grounded in rights of kind of non-discrimination and equality, all grounded in rights of self-determination, which is a right that all peoples have. And what this declaration is saying, for Indigenous peoples, here are some things that you need to particularly give effect to if you're going to ensure non-discrimination, if you're going to ensure self-determination of Indigenous peoples. And so international law, or those kind of international declarations, or even if they are treaties in the UN human rights space, they're always a little bit tricky in terms of enforceability. But it's not to say that there isn't any enforceability. And in fact, some of those key human rights, fundamental human rights, are well recognised as being legally enforceable rights at an international level. And the important thing about, one of the important things about the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is that it now forms part of the suite of international human rights that New Zealand has to report against periodically. And so New Zealand has to front up at the UN and say, here's how we're doing with the implementation of our rights, including Indigenous people's rights. And they will get scrutinised on that by other states. And there's a kind of political peer pressure going on. New Zealand wants to look like it's a good human rights abiding international citizen. And so actually having other states query that can be quite useful. The other thing about the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that I think is important for us, and this is what the He Puapua group and report talked about, was they said if you're going to implement the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in Aotearoa, that also means properly implementing Te Tiriti. And Tai Hakure Jury talked about when, at the point where New Zealand changed its position on the declaration and kind of endorsed it, and he said, this is the third part in a trilogy. We had the Declaration of Independence of 1835, which set out and said to the rest of the world, here's the authority that the rangatira hold. We had Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which provided for the maintenance of that tino rangatiratanga, but also created a space for kāwanatanga, so expressing what that tino rangatiratanga would be like in a kind of nation state. And then this Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a kind of elaboration on the rights that are protected. So Te Tiriti o Waitangi, 3 articles and a preamble, whereas the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People has, I think, 46 articles. So it goes into a bit more detail and elaboration of how you might implement, what self-determination means for Indigenous peoples in particular contexts.
Kia ora. So what can we do as Māori, to get clued up, read up about it, or to empower our own communities about this, to go hand in hand with we saw the Hīkoi, activations at Te Tiriti, and how do we bring in all this mahi that you guys yourself and Matua Moana Jackson and Takuta Margaret Mutu and the others, everyone involved, how do we bring that kōrero in? I know it's happening, but what are your recommends on that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And there's a whole range of kind of resources available that people can go and find, and ranging from like even Ned Fletcher's book about the English text of the treaty, which is a huge volume, but also through to reports like Mātiki Mai and He Puapua. But as you say, those are still longish things. But there's lots of resources. I think E Tangata is a great resource and has lots of really accessible and good information. One of the things I thought was really good to see, despite the damage that the Treaty Principles Bill process has done, I think, but it was really good to see so many, people, submission writing workshops were going on everywhere. People were having those conversations with each other. And I think that's one of the most useful things to do, is to talk to each other about what your understanding is. And maybe other people have slightly different understandings, and you can kind of discuss and figure out what makes sense, and then maybe go to some other resources to confirm those things or check out what your understanding is. But those processes of wānanga really, I think, are really helpful in us having building our collective understanding and being able to engage in things like the hīkoi and the activations. I remember, again, Tai Hakure talking about, this was at a Hungaroa one year, it was maybe the 20th anniversary of the Hungaroa Māori Law Society, and he was sort of reflecting on when there had been gains made for Māori over that 20-year period, and he talked about that always happened where you had a kind of alignment of people who were, some people working within the kāwanatanga space, but you had people doing the kind of direct action activation kind of stuff, because that's what brought the political pressure to bear. But the third part of it was the kind of work that, it was like people like Donna Aotearoa who were writing about Māori sovereignty and providing that kind of analysis and that engagement with those ideas that could really support the activism that was taking place. And he said it's when those things come together that things happened. And so that's why those conversations amongst ourselves, those wānanga, are really important.
Cool, thank
Kia ora,
you.
bro. And even just now, this little wānanga that we're having now, for our people that are out here listening, that's just another little Lego thing that goes on top. Yeah,
and that's the other thing. There's lots of written resources, but there's also now lots of audio, video things. Like you can go on YouTube and find moana talking about stuff, and those are all great. We use those a lot in our Ahunga Tikanga program.
Yeah, kia ora, bro. Oh, kia ora, Carwyn. Thanks so much for your mātauranga and your wisdom and your tau. Try to take that on next time I have these conversations in the future. But tēnei te mihi ki a koe. Kia ora. Cheers.
Porokāte is a podcast by the Hori and te kuru. Toi tu te porokāte, toi tu te reo Māori, Ko te reo